So our last speaker is Zeynep Tufekci from the University of North Carolina. She writes a blog called Technosociology, Our Tools Ourselves. And Zeynep graced the PDF stage last June, came to my attention originally for writing what I thought was the single best response to Malcolm Gladwell's, I think, misguided criticism of networking tools as tools for organizing. And Zeynep has been all over this year, including big parts of the Middle East, and I think is going to bring a bit of an international perspective as well to this conversation, which is absolutely required.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't write about Gladwell much anymore. I think 2011 is the answer to him, period. I don't really know what else I can say. See, I really want to discuss some of the where do these movements go and how do they interact with old power question that Clay started talking, partly because I'm really deeply immersed right now in the networks in the Middle East, in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, elsewhere, who are grappling with the next steps kind of questions. And I think just the way that the Egyptians were inspired by the Tunisians, who then inspired the occupied people, and then Egyptians themselves were inspired and they occupied their own cabinets, and there's this big network of inspiration going on. I think we can learn a lot from each other and also from history to understand. And I was listening to, I was really fascinated by listening to the story, and my Twitter feed was expecting Paul Revere to come up any minute and save the day. But there was one big part missing from your story, which was you guys ran it in the primaries. And I think without that step, you might have been a very cute footnote in history, of which I know many. And I don't really want to sort of talk about lots of past things, but I think that's a very important lesson, is that people try again and again and again. This is not a unique thing. It's not like, oh, it happened now and it just created this magic. If you look at the history of Egypt, I can give you 10 examples of similar protests to the January 25. If you want history of Tunisia, I can give you 20. I can talk about so many things like that. If you want to talk about Rosa Parks, I can talk about Claudette Colvin, who did exactly what she did 9 months ago, but was not picked on purpose by the black churches because they thought she would not be a good representative. She was 15 and not as respectable and presentable in Rosa Parks. So a lot of what you read in your history as one person did this and boom, magic happened, is actually a lot of institutional power mixing with new kinds of power, right? Tactical innovation is the history of successful movements. The lunch counter protests are brilliant tactical innovations. The Occupy Zuccotti Park is a brilliant tactical innovation. And tactical innovations all lose their power over time because power figures out how to respond to them, and then it kind of gets boring, and then the attention fades. And then the civil rights movement was brilliant, if you study its history, in finding new tactical innovations when the old ones failed, and confronting power with its new kind of power where power was weakest. And one of the things they did was the power of the image, and taking American values behind them and saying, are you going to beat children and women with your horses and your dogs and your fire hoses? And in the age of television, that was no longer possible. The way in the age of Twitter and Facebook, it's really no longer possible for authoritarian regimes to rule the way they did before. Yes, they can still repress, but not the old way where everybody kind of sat and waited. They can massacre their people, they can try to censor everything. So there's a lot of shift going on. And I want to also say, I'm going to be I want to bring some criticism into this so that we can discuss this, but you have no idea how sympathetic I am to the power of the network argument. I mean, that's what I study, that's what I've been involved in. I'm a former programmer myself, and I talk to lots of people in power all the time, and I tell them all this, and I tell them, your top-down days are over. But I'm kind of lying, because it's not. They're still in power. I tell them that, and I hope to urge them to open up and to reconsider new ways of it. But in the end, if we stop by congratulating ourselves on the healing power of our networks, which they may well have, we are going to have what the Egyptian activists are currently going through, which is they staged another sit-in of Tahrir at the same time Egypt was about to run with elections. And the executive power ran with the elections anyway. And the sit-in completely fizzled. And they weren't able to organize for the elections either. They barely have any representation in the parliament, and that parliament's going to write the constitution. So I'm not saying the protest that Tahrir does not have its power still. It does. But there's also elections. That scheduled insurrection, I love that line. I am going to steal it from here on. In fact, that's what teachers always do, or speakers. You just steal the good lines when you find them. But that kind of, the moment of protest is very powerful. The moment of that kind of collaboration is very powerful. The next question is, how do you take that? And what Tea Party did was actually take its strongest moment to the weakest moment in existing power structures, which are the primaries. Before the word was there, you guys occupied the primaries. I mean, that's the name of what you did in current, 2011 lexicon, is you occupied the primaries to a lot of consequences. So how do you do that without becoming just one more faction, then everything goes back to the way it was? Now, those are really critical, interesting, and not easy questions. I don't have an answer that I can just pull out of my back pocket. But they almost always involve new power and old power intersecting in ways that you didn't really necessarily think when you started all this discussion. And I want to sort of say that from Egypt to Zuccotti, one thing that I keep seeing is that, and this is a common thing, yes, we're not living under Mubarak, and there's a lot of differences, and yes, our police brutality is pretty bad, but still it's not the same thing as people getting killed. Well, what we're seeing is this huge failure of institutions. We have a failure of institutions from the unions, to the political parties, to all the other institutions that are supposed to do certain things to protect people in particular ways, to regulate things. There's a failure of institutions in terms of where ordinary people are concerned. The mistake would be to think that their failure means that they're irrelevant to you. Because I wanted to, I'm now in University of North Carolina. I was listening to the North Carolina stories, and I'm sort of learning. I just moved there, learning the place. And I wanted to say, they're not coming to rescue you. That's very true. But they are coming for you in many ways. They're there, and they're coming for you. Because you cannot, just because they're not there to help you or improve your life, doesn't mean you can completely turn your back to them and be free of the influence that's going to come anyway. That might not be good. That might be a bank refusing to do mortgage business, the kind of old power we saw. And that would affect the community really badly, and that's been, it's now illegal. What we saw in institutional failure of the regulation of the banking business has plunged the world into a major global recession. And in our country, it's meant people losing homes. It's also is combined with the climate change and other things, is increasing the price of food. And that's no joke, because that's going to push the infant mortality up in poorer countries. Right? We lose our homes, they lose their kids. That's kind of the way the global economy works. It's horrific, but that's the truth of it. So I want to sort of talk about how, in the next sort of question and answer, how do you use these new tools, which do allow for, I think, very novel, very interesting, very fascinating. Okay, I was going to tell another story, but I'll tell you guys the story of Tahrir supplies. I don't think anybody's followed this, but in the second Tahrir uprising, I just interviewed these kids, and I call them kids because they're in their 20s, and like kids in their 20s are kids to me now. I'm getting old. I saw this tweet, kind of corner of my eye, saying, well, wait, we're Tahrir supplies. We're going to coordinate the field hospitals. I'm like, what? And here's the setup. There's a couple thousand activists and more coming in, ordinary people coming into Tahrir, and there are fights going on in a street called Mohammed Mahmoud Street, where the police are using tear gas canisters, made in Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. I can't think of a worse way to do diplomacy than that. And they're shooting them like guns at people, and they're shooting rubber bullets at people, and there are thousands of people being injured. And there are field hospitals to take care of these people. But of course, who needs what? At what field hospital? Who's going to go where? And where are the doctors? And what's going on? Right? This is actually the kind of thing that brings down Napoleon and Hitler and everybody that you read about in history. So there's one person, along with his 2 other 20-something friends, said, why don't we start a Twitter feed to take care of this? Because they didn't really want to do retweets, because when you do a retweet, you don't know how old the request was. And they played with hashtags, and they said, we're going to coordinate this. Okay, fast forward due to time constraints. 5 days later, 17,000 followers, 10 field hospitals, fully stocked, completely accounted for, with 2-hour by 2-hour inventory, so that anything that was extra anywhere else would be moved from place to place, with complete coordination of doctors, nurses, the kind of first aid that was necessary, including where ambulances would need to go in case of more severe injuries. 3 kids, 3 20-some-year-olds with 1 Twitter feed and a couple of Google Docs and a website, and they solved the problem that, got Hannibal stuck in the Alps and Napoleon in Moscow and all of that. And I'm just sort of amazed at watching this happen. And this is no joke. 34 people died in this period. A couple thousand people were injured. So these kids probably saved, maybe a few dozen people's lives, and probably saved a lot of major infections, injuries. I mean, this is happening. I mean, this is not just, oh, I just need some stitches. This is serious, life-threatening. Dozens of people died. So I'm talking to one of them, the founder, and I said, where'd you get the idea? He said, cupcakes. Like, what? He said, oh, there's this cupcake store in Cairo, and they're really successful promoting their business through Twitter. And I thought, if cupcakes can do it, we can coordinate the field hospitals. And I thought, okay, that's one way to look at it. And he thought, it's word of mouth, and they coordinate when they're going to sell the cupcakes and when the Oreo cupcakes are in demand versus not. And I thought, why don't we do that for who needs more, stitching material or betadine? And I thought, actually, you're right. That's not a really bad inspiration. And that was his experience in social media, watching a Cairo cupcake store sell through word of mouth, and he coordinated 10 field hospitals for a week. So this kind of power is, on the one hand, very impressive. So I tell this story to say this is amazing that people can do this. On the other hand, a lot of my friends in Egypt are now thinking, what next? Because they didn't really get up and organize for the elections using this power. They wanted to stay in Tahrir because that's what they knew what to do, and they missed the next moment, which the civil rights movement was very smart in not missing. That the history of civil rights movement is looking and saying, what is next? And it's not always done in the right way. The reasons they chose Rosa Parks over Claudette Colvin are not pretty, because the other woman was young and not as good looking and all of that. So I'm not going to sort of just say, oh, it was all perfect. We don't have to replicate their mistakes. But we have to figure out how to combine old and new power. And I'll end with what happened yesterday, just yesterday, with a friend of mine to show you guys how this can get really weird. Alexander Page is the pseudonym of a Syrian activist whose name is now out, Rami. He fled Syria, like within an inch of his life. He had to flee in 3 hours. Somebody warned him, and he just grabbed his baby daughter, infant, and wife, and ran to Egypt. Was traveling to Qatar to participate in a conference. And again, I keep seeing these tweets out of the corner of my eye, and they ruin my day, because then my whole day is this, and it's just a crazy world. And he tweeted, I'm in Doha immigration, and the bureaucrats here are telling me my visa's blah, 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 not valid, blah, 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 and they're going to deport me back to my country of origin, Syria, where he wouldn't live long enough for us to have a free Rami hashtag. He'd be killed probably instantly. So we all panicked because, I don't know. I'm originally from Turkey, and I am so used to immigration with, just messing something up and saying, oh, okay, now we're going to send you back to blah, blah, blah that you've never even seen, and all sorts of, because it's kind of this no man's legal land. And we were really panicking because it's the middle of the night in Qatar, and talking to lots of people, trying to figure out what to do. At that moment, I was thinking, we're trying to really use a 21st century tool, Twitter, to solve a 20th century, quintessential 20th century problem. We have the bureaucratic Kafka who's going to send a man to certain death and torture because he can't get his paperwork in order. So in the middle of the night in Doha, we found someone who found someone, I'm not kidding now, to wake up a Qatari sheikh to go to the airport and go and say, I am now going to go to immigration and pluck this guy out. So it was 17th century power meeting with 21st century power. I mean, this must have been history's first Twitter dispatch sheikh. So 21st century power dispatch 17th, because that's what we needed. We needed in Qatar at the moment 17th century power, because it was just not going to be taken care of in time through any reasonable method we could come out. And they plucked him out, and he's fine. It's this kind of close call. But that kind of strategic thinking, right? Somebody didn't say, oh, I am not going to interact with old kind of power. The question was, how do you interact with old kind of power, but not get co-opted to the degree that you get nothing out of it, but where you imprint your values and where you make a mark or where you make a stance. And the biggest question is what Mika, I'm trying to pronounce it right, but I never get it. It calls the, how do you say go, not just no, and what Clay was saying in terms of how do we go from it's easier to mobilize a unified no, and this is not just a social media problem, it's always been more complicated to organize for actual change rather than stopping something bad happening to you. But we live in the kind of world, if we don't figure that out, we're all in big trouble. I apologize to my students all the time, like your generation, sorry guys, we are leaving you with a lot of problems. But and I really would like to discuss not just how great we are with our networks, and I talk about that all the time to lots of people, but how do we then take the next step? And what are the things that we can and cannot do, and how do we do them? And I think that would be great to open up the rest of the discussion to those questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Zeynep. Leaving aside that Wikipedia has become a little more institutionalized, bureaucratized, why couldn't Congress operate under the neutral point of view approach to writing a bill, which is to say, the bill doesn't pass unless the two sides agree on the same method that opposing sides have to agree on the language of a Wikipedia article. Is that impossible?
Yeah, I have to jump through Wikipedia. Have you been on the discussion pages lately? I don't know, but I'm a pretty sort of comfortable with argument kind of person. I argue all the time on all sorts of platforms. But Wikipedia, I just sort of dipped my toe in, and I thought this is too high conflict for me. It is one of the most high conflict environments you can find for anything that's contested. And by no coincidence, about 90% of the contributors are men. It's a high conflict environment, and the loudest get their way, and they have very nice ways of figuring out how to get a good product out of it anyway. But you have to realize that kind of high conflict environment will necessarily discourage certain kinds of participation. As a result, if you look at sort of wide-scale studies of it, stuff that is of interest to the kind of people who are high conflict, there are lots and lots of entries about them. And it's like male stuff, you have tons of every kind of car you can imagine. If you look at the other end, there isn't. It's just, and I'm not necessarily saying Wikipedia has a lot to teach to us.
I withdraw my Wikipedia suggestion.
Exactly. So I'm sorry. The other thing I want to say is I really don't want to say there is, we should just go vote in elections and that's it, and elections are not at all. What I'm saying is that a lot of times things that look structureless, they have structure. There's a famous essay from the 60s, The Tyranny of No Structure. It means the loudest get to speak. And Gilad was trying to raise this. Networks tend to be hierarchical. Open networks, things like Twitter, things like blogs, tend to generate hierarchies very quickly. This is a very well-studied thing. And I think there are brilliant things in the way the General Assemblies are run, but if you think it doesn't privilege the facilitators and it doesn't discourage certain kinds of person from speaking, that would be wrong too. Now, that doesn't mean we abandon what's good about it, but if we're just sort of blind to everything you set up, there's going to be these age-old political philosophies that Clay is talking about, the tyranny of the minority versus the tyranny of the majority. And technology is going to change the game, but it's not going to change the question. You cannot just wish away these questions. We should discuss how can we better deal with them with all these new tools. And just sort of to close on the Wisconsin thing, I think Wisconsin was, I was saying Kafaya, but it's our Iran moment. I talked to a lot of people in the Middle East who tell me Iran taught us how to do this. And I've heard this from, I had a lot of friends in Wisconsin, so I was kind of involved in spirit. And they called me and said, we're not as good as the Tahrir people. Tell us what they did. And I said, I don't know, but get a router? They didn't have routers in the capital. But the thing about Wisconsin that worked to a degree was to change the conversation that Becca is talking about. That's a very powerful effect. There are studies that show people now, the press has stopped its discussion of, say, the fiscal debt, and now talking a lot also about jobs, unemployment, inequality, those kinds of things. So those are very powerful. But history is full of movements like this failing without improving the lives of the people for the better. There are many attempts that do not go someplace. There is, just because you have good values and good organizations doesn't mean there's some historical, God who's going to come down and say, there you win. So I think the questions are still important for us to consider. I want to end with a little anecdote from a campaign to get a certain coffee chain, Starbucks, to carry fair trade coffee. And the campaign deliberately, at some point, split itself into the guys who wore the suits. It was mostly guys. And the ones that stayed outside, and the people who went in with their suits and well-dressed, whatever, clothes, told the Starbucks people, if you don't carry fair trade, I really can't tell you what these crazies would do to your stores. It's just not us, but they're kind of crazy out there. And it was about a week of that Starbucks started carrying fair trade coffee, just about. So maybe all the points kind of come there. Maybe the question isn't, is Occupy going to run or not? And maybe what you're saying, Jessica, is absolutely right. That in fact, there's no Occupy to make that decision. And there's a big change in the conversation that is really powerful. And it is not for this person or that person.
And
but
time's up.
That has to end with a political change at some point. Yeah.